always forget this. Good morning. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Maria Wawer, who's a member. She's a professor in the Department of Population and Family Health Sciences here at the School of Public Health. She's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University in the School of Public Health, Mailman School of Public Health. She received her medical degree from McMaster University and her Master of Health Sciences from Toronto University, a Canadian, and she's became a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons in Canada in 1984. She's over 25 years of experience in implementation, conduct, and analysis of complex HIV, AIDS, and STD and reproductive health, EPI, and operations research studies in developing countries, including sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, Asia, and Latin America. She's going to talk to us this morning about her work in Rakai, Uganda, specifically the clinical trials that she's worked on there. Thank you, Dr. Wawer.
Dr. Wawer, Maria. Boy, this is a lot more formal than I expected. And Larry, what are you doing here? Okay. Well, I thought that what would be interesting today is to sort of take a 20-year historical walk through some of the experiences of implementing randomized trials in rural Rakai. I hope it's not too untechnical for this group, but I wasn't quite sure how much experiential versus how much sort of technical. So I'll bring up a lot of issues, none of them in great depth. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to stop me and we can discuss it. Oops. Okay, how does this work? Oops. Okay. The project that I'll be discussing, as many of you know, is located in southwestern Uganda in Rakai district, which is the one place that our colleagues and we work. And we've been working there since 1988. And some of the topics that I'd like to discuss today include community versus individually randomized trials in small African communities and some of the rationale for doing a study either as an individually randomized trial or a community randomized trial. I'll discuss some of the background information that it is good to have prior to starting a trial, some selected design issues, some selected implementation activities, issues in interpretation of findings, protocol issues, and some ethical considerations. So it kind of covers a wide range, just to bring up issues and the kinds of things that one has to consider and the kinds of things that sometimes come out of nowhere and completely shock you. Now, crucial data for trial design. This seems incredibly obvious, but let's just go through them. Prior to doing a randomized trial, it's obviously good to have some idea of community attitudes to research, especially the type of intervention you plan to propose, since that was going to have such a huge effect on acceptability and long-term adherence. Before we did our trials of male circumcision for HIV prevention, which I'll discuss, we did multiple focus groups as to how we could basically put the idea of male circumcision into messages for the population that would be acceptable. This is a population that does not have any traditional male circumcision, but approximately 15 to 16% of the population is Muslim, and they are traditionally circumcised. So was this going to cause a problem whereby offering circumcision to Christian men, it'd be seen as somehow having religious connotations? And in some of the focus groups, we heard great messaging. One guy, and we really quoted him a lot, was, well, what's the problem? Jesus was circumcised. Well, we hadn't thought of that one, but yes, I mean, it's true. I mean, it sort of takes it out of the realm of this being specific to one group and something that might be acceptable to other groups. Now, if you're going to be doing cluster randomization, which is one of the two designs I'll discuss, you have to know sort of what are the community's boundaries. Depending on what kind of intervention you are implementing, how much contamination are you going to get from the outside into your community, or how much is the message or the intervention that you're implementing going to diffuse out into your control arm. So how do you define community? And that can really differ by the type of intervention you are doing. Now, here's one that when we first got started, was really quite shocking. If you're doing, let's say, a randomized trial of STD control or HIV prevention, etc., how good are your lab tests? Especially if you're doing relatively large surveys, how much can you trust the data you get from the lab to tell you what your baseline rates are and what the rates of new infection are? HIV Western blot is much harder to read in Africa, for example, than it is in North America, because there's some of the bands are also, Western blot bands are also affected by malaria. Rapid HIV tests, we have seen and published, so have other groups, of overreading of some rapid HIV tests, such as the Determine, because it's a visual test, and particularly in a trial situation where people are really, really, really trying to be very careful that they don't misread bands, they tend to overread. So in one of our studies, we actually found that we were starting to give people false positive results, and we had to immediately stop, go back to the drawing board, get back to those people, tell them that they were not positive. And theoretically, these tests should be extremely highly sensitive and specific, but there's the human element involved as well. HSV2 serology, we found that we were overreading and had to raise our optical density levels. Because again, in rural African sera, the tests were working differently than in North America. So that if you want to have precision in your studies, as say both at baseline and then to assess your impact, make sure that the tests you are using have been validated in the population that you will be using them in. And, you know, obviously, and have potentially backup tests, confirmation tests, whatever, but don't, just because a test is there doesn't mean it's going to work for you in your settings. And again, the examples I'll be giving are related to STIs, to HIV in Africa, because that's where I work, but the same principles apply anywhere. And then what is the underlying incidence or prevalence of the target condition? And this seems like a no-brainer, but there have been multiple trials recently, microbicide trials, the recent Botswana Truvada PrEP trial, where the HIV incidence in the control arm was about half of what the study had been powered upon. So that basically people were being, I don't know how to put it, it's not obviously being optimistic that you think you've got a higher incidence, but in effect, they were assuming that incidence was a lot higher based on observational data, based on technologies such as BED that can really overread incidence at population levels. It still needs a lot of tweaking before it can really be used reliably, such that in order to really have a trial, it really makes sense to do the prep work to really know what the rates of your conditions are. And that requires patience. It also requires trying to convince the donors to give you the money to do the prep work, so that you're not going in cold, not knowing exactly what the rates of the conditions are. Now, in Rakai, I must admit, we are lucky and spoiled, because most of our research is nested around our community cohort, a cohort that has been in operation now since 1994, and where we do continuous annual surveillance in 56 villages with annual behavioral surveys, sociodemographic surveys, and the collection of biological samples for HIV, STI, and other assessments. So we know exactly what our incidence rates are, prevalence rates, risk factors, how they're distributed. So we're in a position where organizing randomized trials can occur much more quickly because we don't need to go do the prep work. But it also, I'd say, makes a plea that there really is value to having cohorts. And cohorts are hard to keep funded and maintained because donors consider cohorts to be really quite passé, a bit boring. So why a cohort? Well, because if you've got that cohort, you can start a trial several years faster than you would if you didn't have a cohort. Yes?
Does it affect the generalizability of your findings? Given that you've been here since 1994, you probably have influenced the population in some way.
I wish we had influenced it more. When we look at our HIV rates and other behavioral factors compared to the National Survey, etc., the difference is not that great. Our trends in condom use really track with national rates. We have, since it's an open cohort, we have about 15 to 17% new in-migrants every year. So we can also compare our findings from those people who have been in the cohort a long time to new arrivals. And then in a randomized trial, when we talk about the trial of male circumcision, even if the population were somewhat atypical, once you've randomized and you're trying the same intervention in both arms, then sort of the biological aspects of that intervention should theoretically work as well because of randomization to see whether circumcision really does make a difference. So I say we are a bit spoiled. Now, I'll talk a little bit about a couple of randomized controlled trial designs using two examples from Rakai. One, a community-based or cluster-based randomization, which we used for our trial of STI control for HIV prevention. And within it was nested a study of STI control to improve pregnancy outcomes, including reduction of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And then I'll talk about individually randomized, but with a slight community twist, which I'll explain to you shortly, male circumcision for HIV and STI prevention, and to look at prevention of transmission of HIV to female partners. That is, among positive men, if they're circumcised, does the circumcision reduce transmission of HIV or other pathogens to female partners? Now, with respect to randomized trials of bacterial STI control for HIV prevention, there have been 6 reported to date, and the Rakai trial, the nested one, I'm counting as a 6th one, but it really is nested within the overall Rakai trial, which was a community randomized trials. 5 of the 6 trials that looked at STI control for HIV prevention, of bacterial STI for HIV prevention, were community randomized rather than individually randomized. The only one that was individually randomized was a trial among commercial sex workers. Now, this is not a seminar where we're particularly asked to discuss results, so I won't be going into results in any detail, but just to very quickly set the scene, the first trial of STI control for HIV prevention reported approximately 35% reduction in new HIV incident cases in the intervention compared to the control. So there was a lot of buzz. The Titanic had started to move, as in this is the way to go. CDC, WHO, etc. were all jumping on the STI bandwagon for HIV prevention. Approximately 2 years later, our trial came out. Now, it can't be more negative than this. 1.5 per 100 person years incidence in the intervention compared to the control. We'll talk a little bit about the, how this was received. But then, since then, all the other trials, whether it's our own nested maternal infant trial, another trial in Masaka, the commercial sex work individually randomized trial, and a Zimbabwe trial, all showed no effect of STI control for HIV prevention. Again, these are bacterial STIs that I'm talking about now, but the trials that have been published to date of HSV2 suppression for HIV prevention have also been completely negative. We can discuss later on what some of the theories as to why this didn't work later on. Now, why do community randomized trials? Obviously, the nature of the intervention is one that some interventions lend themselves much more to a community randomized design than to an individual design. Community randomized trials also provide data on both the individual and the community effects. In some circumstances, randomizing communities can increase acceptability and reduce stigma. there can be reduced partner self-selection because you're basically enrolling everybody in a community. You're going out to them rather than expecting people to sort of sign up because there's a little sign on the Hopkins board, you know, if anybody wants to be in a study of this, please come and visit Dr. So-and-so. But you're going out and you are trying to motivate people within a group to participate. You might get a more generalizable result because your population is more typical. The data from a community randomized trial provide information on many population subgroups, which can facilitate nested studies and analyses. And it allows assessment of population attributable risk. Now, with respect to the nature of the intervention, the reason that so many of the early trials of STD control went to community randomized is because STDs aren't an individual issue. STDs, by definition, travel through sexual networks. And if you are only enrolling people as individuals, the chances that they might get reinfected, that there might be contamination, are very high. Whereas if you are managing to cover most of the person's sexual network, then that person is less likely to become rapidly reinfected. And this, I think, is particularly important in Africa, where the data suggests there really is much more sexual concurrency, much denser sexual networks. People don't have more partners, but they have more overlapping partners. And there's nothing that an STD likes better than a nice overlapping, dense sexual partnership. So to cover that partnership does make a lot of sense. Also, if you were only enrolling HIV negatives into a trial of STI control for HIV prevention, which is the way most individually randomized trials would work, no sense enrolling positives into a trial of HIV prevention. They're already positive. You know, you can treat their STDs all you want, but you're not going to not keep them from getting infected. So at a community level where you're treating everybody for STIs, you're treating positives and negatives. And because you've got the whole community, which covers most of the sexual network, in effect you're gaining data not only on is acquisition of HIV reduced among people who've been treated for STIs compared to communities where people have not received the intensive STI intervention, but you're also seeing, if positive individuals get treated for STIs, is there less transmission of HIV to other individuals? So you've got greater bang for the buck. You're looking both at transmission and acquisition. Now, I won't belabor all of this since I'm sure most of you know all of these things, but just to sort of quickly mention, one of the biggest challenges in the design of a community or cluster randomized trial is the whole issue of whether you want more small clusters or a smaller number of large clusters. Now, ideally, what you want is a large number of large clusters. However, budgetary considerations and logistical considerations make it impossible to always have the numbers of stuff you want. So a smaller number of large clusters reduces contamination. For something like STD control, I mean, the larger your cluster, particularly in a rural area where travel is somewhat limited, the larger your cluster, the less probability that there will be rapid reintroduction of STIs into a community. There is reduced intercluster correlation, and the logistics are somewhat less complex if you have a smaller number of large clusters, because you just get your teams out there, you put up whatever temporary infrastructure you've got for the activity as it's going on, and you're not sort of traveling continuously to new clusters every day. So just logistically, particularly, again, we're talking rural Africa, we're talking bad roads, anything that makes logistics easier is a researcher's dream and prayer. However, a larger number of smaller clusters increases power, simplifies the analytic methods tremendously. You can have a smaller sample size, so you can reduce the population per cluster. So there's a real trade-off between number of clusters and size of clusters. In Rakai, what we did is we ultimately took the 56 communities that were going to be in our study, aggregated them into 10 clusters of between 4 and 7 communities, about 1,000 persons per cluster, and then randomized them to 5 clusters per arm. Mwanza and Masaka, each, 2 of the other studies that I had mentioned, each had 6 clusters per arm. Now, we would never do that again. This was just not enough clusters. This was going on to almost 20 years ago. A lot of the work on statistical work, on power with these kinds of cluster randomized designs was being developed. We were working with Ron Brookmeyer. We did a lot of thinking. The Mwanza and other folks did a lot of thinking. But what we didn't realize is just how potentially underpowered we were going to be. Now, with our ultimate result, 1.5, 1.5, we could have had a gazillion clusters with a population size 10 times higher, and the result was still negative. But it would have been a heartbreak had we been in a situation where there was a suggestion that there was a positive effect, and that ultimately, when we did our analyses, we were underpowered. So we would never go with these few clusters again. For one thing, all it takes is for one cluster being blown. Suddenly something completely unusual happens in one cluster. A new road gets put in. And a new road can so change HIV and STI dynamics. These things travel by road, by truck. A new road going through one of our clusters could easily have made it very different from the other clusters, such that the randomization would no longer have been valid. So do not do this. Go to a larger number. Now, this is just a picture of Rakai district, and the clusters, the pink ones are the intervention clusters, the white ones are the control clusters, and it doesn't look as if the clusters are all that separated, but these were in the bad old days when the roads were really lousy, and it's also a hilly and swampy district. So what we did is we literally drove all around the district to all the communities on secondary roads and asked people, where did they go to market? Where did they go to disco? Where did they go to do any of the other social things they do, on the assumption that where people go is where people also meet Mr. Perfect or Ms. Perfect. And we aggregated towns by how they congregated, how individuals congregated. And this might not look like a big distance, but between these two clusters, there was a big hill and then a swamp. People did not have cars in those days. When we started this, there were fewer than 1% of houses with any kind of motorized vehicles. And you have to be pretty strongly in love to drag that bicycle over the mountain, through the swamp to the lady in the next village. Much easier to fall in love with somebody next door. And what we found when we did our studies of how many people had partners external to their community, 85% of all sexual encounters were with people inside the communities. Now, even there, that's not perfect. There was more in and out, or truckers coming in, whatever, that we were not able to completely seal off these communities. One never can. But at least the majority of the sexual encounters were within the population.
Those are roads, not rivers?
Those are all roads. Those are all roads. And there's Lake Victoria.
And what would you do differently now, knowing what you know? What cluster size would you try to get?
I think what we would have done is probably try to get more funding and have additional clusters further away. In other words, I don't think we would not want to cut these clusters into smaller clusters in order to have more clusters, because, again, in our work, people from here would go to a market here, as well as people from this end of the cluster. So in other words, if you chop these up into smaller clusters and randomize them, you'd get a lot more contamination. What we would have needed to do is expand the geographic area, which also would have substantially expanded the costs. But that is what we would do now. Now, another reason why one would want to do community randomized trials of STD control for HIV prevention is acceptability and stigma. Individual randomization may be less acceptable in some studies and some study settings. In rural African villages, a lot of decisions are more communal than individual. Now, it's not that one wants to put community pressure on people to participate if they don't want to participate. On the other hand, the decision-making process isn't sort of that somebody just decides to do something, but rather the community discusses it. There are town hall meetings. There's much more reliance on the opinions and advice of others. So, which also can complicate the informed consent process, because you really want to make sure that that person sitting in front of you who's going to consent to be in a study feels comfortable saying no. So obviously our consent process is always very, very private, so that one gets a sense of whether the individual is really comfortable, and it's not just because the village leader said, hey, we're all going to do this. But again, the whole decision-making process is different, so the village leader saying something does influence people, and that's not necessarily bad, but you just want to make sure it doesn't become coercive. Now, the other thing is, these are small African villages. Everybody knows everybody's business. You can't have a whopping big STD truck drive up to your home to enroll you in a study, because everybody's going to know you've been enrolled in an STD study, and then, oh, well, I wonder what he's been up to. Why are they enrolling him? So, however, if you enroll entire communities, it becomes less stigmatizing. You know, nobody's saying that Joe Blow or Sam Smith are good or bad guys with respect to sexual activity. This community has been selected to be either in the control arm or the STI treatment arm. And by the way, this was a placebo-controlled study. We not formulated, but we packaged helminths in similar packaging to the antibiotics in our treatment arm, antibiotics in our control arm, and helminths, so that people would not know which arm they were in. And at the end of the study, we did ask people, which arm do you think you were in? And it was completely random. 50% of the people guessed correctly, 50% guessed incorrectly in both arms.
People didn't know that they pooped out a whole pile of worms the next day? One of the things that makes anthelmintic therapy one of the most popular interventions around is that moms and people see the worms come out.
Well, we weren't giving it to kids.
Yeah.
So,
but even in adults, we're pretty happy about it.
Well, at the end, say when we asked, people were... actually, that issue during all the years of the trials never came up as an issue. Good point, but anyway, privacy is just not the same as in Western cultures, and it's very important working with colleagues and wherever one is working to try to figure out, what are the social dynamics that might affect your trial. Now, this is just a very schematic diagram of how the trial was organized. It said the 5 clusters in each arm. There was a home visit every 10 months, census survey, interview, sample collection, blood, urine, self-selected vaginal swabs, placentas from pregnant women. And then in one arm, we did mass STD treatment. Literally, when I say mass, I mean mass. We went to every door once a year, and everybody between the ages of 15 to 59, as long as they had consented, was offered single-dose STI treatment. Azithromycin, ciprofloxacin, metronidazole, and they gave blood for syphilis serology. Within hours of having taken the oral dose, basically their gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomonas was gone. The metronidazole reduced bacterial vaginosis, even though BV, of course, is never really curable. And then within 24 hours, we were back to give anybody who needed IM penicillin for syphilis. They were treated within 24 hours. In the control arm, it was the mass and helminth vitamins, and then they received a bunch of services, including referral for current illness, health education, condom promotion, provision of voluntary HIV testing and counseling, and some general health care. So it was a pretty intensive data collection, which took approximately an hour and a half per person. But because there had been a lot of community preparation, and again, because I think the community randomized design helped, basically the annual participation rate was over 90%, and of the participants who participated, over 90% provided HIV samples among women vaginal swabs, over 90% accepted mass treatment in each arm, and of women who were pregnant, 75% saved their placentas for us. Yeah.
What are the expectations of the people in these communities about participation in the study? How are they elicited? And do they change over time?
The way they were, you mean how do we elicit the expectations?
Yeah. What is your understanding of their understanding of getting into this in the first place, of continuing with it, given the somewhat both collective, I won't say public, nature of decision making? What do you guys know about how that shapes whose expectations you're getting at, et cetera? I mean, that's the...
Well, that's, as I was mentioning, there is the community aspect, but again, I'll discuss a trial that we did that was individually randomized. So just to give a contrast. But I think, first of all, with the community meetings, and in each of these studies, before Rakai starts any program, there is a whole motivation team that goes out, and some of the Ugandan principal investigators go out and discuss with the community, what this is about, why it's being done, what we don't know. In other words, we don't know if STI control is going to work. Later on, I'll go talk about circumcision. We don't know if circumcision is going to work for prevention. And then the informed consent process is very, very private. And the informed consent process for one of these trials can be an hour and a half, where the informed consent form is read in Uganda, and there's a lot of discussion. And for the STD control trial, people were told, if you prefer not to be enrolled, we're not going to tell anybody that you individually decided not to be in this trial. You can change your mind next year if you want, but you don't have to be in this. And you will continue to get all the services that you would normally get from the Rakai program. So you encourage people to participate, but our teams have been trying very, very hard to never make it coercive. And as far as what people understand, I mean, the teams do all sorts of things, like saying, the reason your village was selected is like, there are games of chance, and they'll say, if you were playing such and such a game, then your village would have won this or that in this game of chance. So I think, and whenever one of our study ends, the program has gotten delegations from the community saying, can you do another study? We go back. When I say we, I don't mean me personally. In Uganda, we don't have a single full-time expatriate. The program is entirely run by our Ugandan colleagues, physicians, PhDs. It really is their program. And they're the ones who originally invited us to come and work with them, rather than us landing and saying, would you like to work with us? So there's a lot of dialogue that occurs with the communities. We've got a community advisory board, and a lot of just going out there and sitting under the tree with folks and discussing. But, as you can see, the participation rates are very high. Now, just a few little things I'm going to touch upon. In doing any kind of a community randomized trial in a rural area, one of the things that you are really, really, really working on is logistics. It's more like a military operation than research for all intents and purposes, because you need incredibly close attention to logistics to make sure you've got quality control and that the flow of samples and documents stays clean and efficient. These are just a picture of the backpacks that were packed for every interviewer the night before. in every backpack, which had every interviewer's name on it, to which interviewer it belonged, they would get every bit of paper, pencil, sample collection, equipment, etc., that they needed for that day. So that there was no running around in the field, I forgot my labels, or I forgot such and such. It was all there, and actually everybody had 2 packs, one pack that they took with them into the field that day, and one that was being repacked by the logistical department. And in the morning, it's again like a military campaign. There are 8 trucks that leave at 7:30 in the morning, each truck with exactly the right people on it, the right supervisor, the right lists of who is going to be interviewed and bled and otherwise provide samples that day. Photo IDs for everybody, because one of our problems is people try to sneak into the studies. And we've had situations where people impersonate in order to get into a study. And we tell people, look, if you live in this community, even if you decide not to be in this study, you still get the services. Certain things we can't give you. If you don't want to give us blood for HIV testing, we can't give you your HIV result. But on the other hand, our clinics, you can come to our clinics, the health education, etc., but people actually come from other communities and try to sneak in. And then, just the incredible control on every sample at every step of the way and every piece of paper. Because it's so easy. I mean, you were collecting per year, just from the cohort, given that on average everybody provides 3 samples just from the cohort, we're talking 45,000 samples just from this one research activity. You don't want anything to go amiss. And then the results come out. And I'd already shown you the result before, a textbook negative trial, not a failed trial, but a textbook negative trial. And this was kind of the reaction internationally. Because I'd mentioned, the ship was already leaving, everybody was getting aboard the STD control for HIV prevention bandwagon, and suddenly our results come out, and nada. So nothing focuses the mind like a negative trial. My first reaction, the blood runs cold, and the first thing, really smart thing that came out of my mouth was, I wonder if the statistician could have reversed the codes. Well, he can reverse the codes all he wants. The incidence is identical in both arms. So, and then the next one is, how could this have happened? What are these data going to tell us? And then you really get to work. Now, again, I'm not going to go into all the gazillion results and analyses we did, but I'll just briefly touch on some of the things that informed our thinking. Again, the advantages of a cluster randomized trial is that we had, in effect, multiple nested studies. And I already mentioned the study that looked at STD treatment in mothers on child HIV and health. And I won't go into all the details, but just because of the way the trial was designed, in effect, the STD control in pregnancy was somewhat more intensive than in the general population. So if there was any subgroup where, if there was really an STI control effect, we were going to see it in the pregnant women. And here we see one of our pregnant ladies, her little baby. And this lady, she had actually packed her placenta in banana leaves for us. We'd not had the chance to get her the bucket with the formalin that the mothers were asked to leave their placentas in because we were just starting that sub-study. This woman had heard that we wanted placentas and packed it in banana leaves for us. Placenta. And what we found is that the STI control in the pregnant women substantially and significantly reduced gonorrhea and chlamydia in the women. Trichomonas reduced by over 70%, even bacterial vaginosis reduced by about 25%. No difference in syphilis because we treated syphilis equivalently in both arms. We really felt it would be unethical if we had a woman with syphilis in the control arm not to just go and treat her rather than refer her as we were doing with other groups. And the single STD treatment during pregnancy significantly reduced in the infants low birth weight, preterm birth, and early neonatal deaths, but had absolutely no effect on mother-to-child transmission. Again, negative, and it had no effect on maternal acquisition of HIV during pregnancy and immediately postpartum. It looks as if the intervention arm is higher than the control, but that was not statistically significant. These numbers were not huge. The bottom line is no HIV effect. Now, the advantages of, again, the community randomized trial is that we were able to look at the population attributable fraction, in this case, the proportion of incident HIV contributed by STIs. And what we found is that even if we had been able to completely eliminate all the STIs out of the population, we would have at most reduced about 17% of the HIV. And we were actually powered to look at 35% reduction. But this is had we been able to eliminate the STIs completely, and we were not able to eliminate the STIs completely. We were able to reduce the rates of STI at the population level by about half overall, more in the pregnant women, by about half in the general population. There was still enough in-migration. There was still the small proportion of people who were not getting treated were enough to keep STIs going. But to some degree, there's also enough transmission without STIs that STIs are like the icing on the cake. Another slide that I don't have here showed that individuals who had no genital ulceration and no high titer syphilis had a rate of HIV acquisition that was tenfold lower than people who had high titer syphilis and genital ulceration. So that basically, having active syphilis really did put you at higher risk, or it was associated with higher risk. But the proportion of people with active recent syphilis was so small in the overall population compared to people who had no STI that most of the acquisitions were still happening in the people with no STI. So the STIs were adding to the risk. They did not account for the epidemic within the population. What we did find, is that the viral load in the HIV-positive partner was the single biggest predictor of transmission in the population. So it was the viral load, stupid, rather than the STI aspects. Is this clear? I'm not sort of muddling this too much? Okay. Now, within this trial, we also saw very clearly that male circumcision was very protective in men who had been circumcised at baseline, protected in the men for HIV acquisition. So basically, and this dovetailed nicely with other observational studies of male circumcision. So we decided to do a trial of male circumcision for HIV prevention. And I call this almost a missed opportunity, because what we proposed to do was a community randomized trial enrolling all consenting men, whether HIV positive or negative, and whether they had or had not accepted VCT, and following up all the women to see what the effects of male circumcision would be on HIV acquisition, HIV transmission, and at the population level, including looking at behaviors. NIH agreed only to fund the individually randomized trial of negative men who accepted VCT. And they also wanted us to put on the consent forms that the reason you are being enrolled is because you are negative. And we said, whoa, we can't do this. If we only enroll negative men, what are some of the consequences one might expect?
You've identified the positive.
Exactly. By definition, if two guys come in and one is accepted for the trial and the other one isn't, whoa. And again, these are small African towns. It's not, everybody knows who is or is not circumcised. All these guys bathe in the same water hole. If you only offer circumcision to the negative men, it is going to become stigmatizing for the positive men, and they are going to run out and get it from whichever quack can give it to them to hide their status. But for the negative men, it's going to become, oh, baby, we don't need to use a condom. I'm negative. I can prove it. They've let me be circumcised. So the social harm of just offering the service to one group, a service that leaves a physical, permanent indication, can be, we were concerned, would be really potentially very nefarious. And also, we had Ezekiel Emanuel, who is an NIH bioethicist, came out and visited us at the time. And he came back saying, well, I just saw two guys sitting on a wall comparing consent forms. Again, the sense of privacy that somebody might have where you take your consent form, lock it in your safe at home, and don't tell anybody what you're up to, that's not the way things are there. So, also, we thought it would be very, very important to look at the effects of male circumcision on women partners. I mean, circumcision doesn't just affect the male. There are potentially ramifications for the couples. Behavioral ramifications, acceptability ramifications. What happens to women's HIV and STI transmission and acquisition if the male is circumcised compared to non-circumcised? So, thank heavens, the Gates Foundation jumped in and basically allowed us to also enroll positive men, allowed us to enroll men who declined HIV results. Now, this is always controversial, but Rakai, in all of our studies, we have always enrolled people who refuse their HIV results. The reason we have done this is partly it's acceptable within Ugandan government regulations. And we feel if you only take the men who accept VCT, it's a much more self-selected population. And it also doesn't give you that chance to keep on making multiple outreach efforts to the guys who originally declined to get their HIV results. When we first started working in Rakai in the cohort, only 10% of the population wanted to get the results. Now it's up to 90% of individuals within these communities have received their results, requested and received their results. It's probably the highest population level coverage of VCT anywhere in the world. But the only way to do that is gradually. But again, some people find that very controversial. And Gates also allowed us to provide us with funding to enroll all consenting spouses of all men in the NIH and Gates trial, and to allow community follow-up of all men and women to look at HIV incidence in the community as circumcision started to be brought in first through the trial and later through services, and to be able to look at the broad risks and benefits of circumcision before national programs start, with the sense also that there's an obligation to the community, not just to the participants. Now, this resulted in a bit of a messy trial, in the sense that you saw the previous STD control, two groups, quite clear. Here we had the negative men enrolled and funded by NIH, the positive men enrolled and funded by Gates, women of the positive men, and then all the other community members. It was a logistical and balancing really challenging, and also writing it up now, because we're doing a lot of publications of it, to try to explain to people exactly what we did is really not easy, because obviously one wants to be completely transparent as to who was in which group. So we spent a lot of time on the method sections of our papers. Okay, the trial of male circumcision. And again, I won't go into a lot of details, but as I'm sure all of you know, there were 3 trials that came out more or less at the same time. Indeed, Kusuma and Rakai came out at exactly the same time, and the same day, the same DSMB. And all the trials showed more than 50% protection in men of from HIV acquisition. In women, we've published that also. Unfortunately, we saw no effect of male circumcision of positive men on transmission of HIV to negative partners. But because we were able to enroll women, we've now also published and have another paper accepted in Lancet, that the female partners of circumcised men have significantly lower rates of trichomonas, bacterial vaginosis, severe BV, and now high-risk HPV. So that with respect to the negative men, if they're acquiring less HIV, presumably they're going to be spreading less HIV. So that's a benefit to women. And then there is the direct benefit to women of reduced STIs in the circumcised men compared to the uncircumcised men. And again, we were the only group that had enrolled women, so that we're able to look at the female effects. By the way, we also looked at women's acceptability of circumcision. About 50% of the women said that nothing had changed after the guy became circumcised. About 40% said it was better. And only about 10% were, sort of nobody was really dissatisfied. But overall, the rates of satisfaction were higher after circumcision than before, which again is really good to know, because one of the things that people often discuss if they feel nervous about the idea of circumcision is, well, will it make people's sex life worse? Well, no. For both the men and the women, post-circumcision, the reports have been very positive.
And the behavior didn't change.
We looked at behaviors in both the intervention and the control arm, and we're now following behaviors out 2 years after the trials, and we have seen no risk compensation or anything like that. And the behaviors in both arms stayed very stable throughout the study. If anything, there was slightly more condom use in the control arm, but not by a large amount, and if anything, that would have somewhat diluted the effect rather than leading to a spurious effect. Now, protocols. Obviously, and here I'm getting a little bit on my high horse. Obviously, one needs a protocol because you need an upfront statement of the primary outcomes and how they will be analyzed, whether it's intent to treat, as treated, whatever. Also, one needs absolute clarity when one is publishing a trial as to how any additional analyses were conducted, whether you did a modified intent to treat, etc. Protocols are there to keep us honest and focused. But I would like to submit that protocols are not sacred text. For example, when we were publishing our results on HPV in women, one of the reviewers said, well, was this an a priori hypothesis? And yes, thank heavens, it had been. But even if it hadn't been, does that mean that one can't look at it and publish it? Well, being very clear that this was a randomized trial, this is exactly how people were randomized, and this is what we then found in the women versus the men. If tomorrow a new bug is discovered we hadn't known of, because we didn't have it in the protocol, doesn't mean we can't do the analysis and report it, as long as we are very honest as to what had been the a priori hypothesis and what were additional analyses. In other words, I think there really is a difference between secondary data analyses and data dredging for the sake of data dredging. But so often people get so hooked on what was in the original protocol as if it were sacred text. So one of the things that we have learned is to write protocols that are honest but as vague as possible. Rather than saying we will use this particular HIV test, we always now write we will use HIV tests such as and or including, but not implying that if tomorrow there's a better HIV test that we can validate and works really well, that we're not going to use it. Or that, say, if some new issue comes up, that we won't use these data to explore it. So that's the art of writing protocols. And then some musings on research ethics. And again, when you're doing randomized trials, particularly on HIV in Africa, there is no, or HIV International, there is no way you aren't going to run into ethical issues that need to be discussed. Consent forms. This is one of our bugaboos. At this point, our consent forms for trials that we've run have been up to 6 dense packed pages and counting. And where do ethics end and legalistic protection for one's institution begin? And how does one somehow balance these two so that it doesn't become completely incomprehensible for the participant? What does the participant need to know from the viewpoint of their safety and their informed consent versus what do the lawyers want you to put in so that, everything is covered? And is there some way of... No, I don't think anybody yet has come up with the best way of dealing with this. And then there's the issue of services provided to the control arm. In our STD control study, these are the services we provided to the control arm, including referral for current illness and STD symptoms. In effect, we were doing syndromic treatment in the control arm because if somebody had a symptom, they were referred to immediate treatment. Symptom-based treatment, because we didn't get our PCR and other results for months afterwards, we were batching and sending to the U.S. still in those days, but at least symptom-based treatment. The other trials of male circumcision, other trials of STI control that I mentioned, the other cluster ones, they were doing symptom-based treatment as their intervention. And here we were doing it for the control. And the other trials were funded through European sources, and the control arms only received the prevailing standard of STI care. Whatever the government would normally offer, they didn't touch it. Because we were predominantly funded by the NIH, in our control arm, there was a question of whether we were over-treating the control. We could not do it because the funding agency was there. You've got to do it. You've got to do it. But on the other hand, there was always the potential that we could have diluted our effect. So the whole issue becomes the individual versus the common good. How much do you give to a control arm? If it dilutes a good intervention to the point where you don't see the effect, there's a lot of social harm in that. But the pressure is always there to do more and more for the control arm in the U.S. system, which is a much more individualistically based system, a much more legalistic system than, let's say, the European, where it's much more a common good issue. Actually, I'll do this and then I'll come back to the other one. With respect to services for both arms, we have now actually heard discussion of whether if somebody wants to do a trial of HIV prevention, something new, will they actually have to offer male circumcision to any males in the trial? Because circumcision is now becoming a standard of care. And my sense is, whoa, this is going to put HIV prevention research back by decades. Because if you expect any trial to offer everything, including building up circumcision facilities, then trials are going to become impossible. Don't deny people what is available. And if there is circumcision available, then refer them for it, but don't hold trials to having to do everything, including the whole issue of antiretroviral therapy. At what CD4 count, and this is ART in both arms when you're doing a trial, who will pay? NIH and Gates don't pay for antiretroviral therapy. Does that mean that you will only be able to do prevention research if you happen to be at a PEPFAR or Global Fund site? Because if there is no ART, you can't do prevention anymore. If PEPFAR or Global Fund end or diminish, as we already are seeing, is that the end of prevention research? Because if you can't provide ART to people, you can't even try to prevent HIV, do studies of HIV prevention. So these are really major issues that I think, there's no one single solution. But I'm really concerned that we not throw the baby with the bathwater. Now, the last element essential for HIV, for the Rakai project, is this is really a Ugandan project. In some ways, I probably should have started with the slide. The very first contact between Rakai researchers, and at that point I was still at Columbia University, was the Ugandans looking for collaborators. They wanted to start doing work in Rakai on HIV, rather than, again, somebody from the U.S. showing up and saying, hey, I'd like to do research with you on HIV. So it's always had a completely strong Ugandan leadership component. Of the 438 people working in Rakai today, 438 are Ugandan. There's one guy there who is basically the NIH liaison between the project, the embassy, CDC, etc. And he is not the program director. He is the PI on one study, but he is not on the program directorship. It's the Ugandans, our Ugandan colleagues, doctors, Sawan Kambo, Sirwada, etc., who really run it. 22 years of continuous collaboration, a career structure for young investigators such that the turnover is really low, and long-term relationships with the community services. Feedback of results. Whenever we have a study, we go back to the communities and let them know what the results are. Such that there's a sense, again, that these communities are working on international research. And it's a real source of pride. And then, last picture. Whew, I made it in exactly 59 minutes. If anybody has any questions, is this room taken right away?
Usually.
Okay. If anybody needs to go, please go. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. IRB.
So
They went through Ugandan and U.S.
so my
IRBs.
question to you then is why is the IRB requiring locally consistent interventions in your control arm? They certainly don't for us doing non-HIV related stuff. We don't invent stuff to give to the control arm and take over the medical care of a community just because we happen to be doing a trial there.
It wasn't the NIH IRB, but with NIH-funded trials, even though we're not part of the networks, we're one of the few independent standalone research groups when it comes to trials. NIH still has a fair amount. There are their various scientific review committees and so on, and they have a fair amount of say. Also, study section had said no. First of all, when you're writing your protocol or your original grant, we've learned that study sections will say, well, you aren't doing enough for the control arm. And then the scientific review committees at NIH also insist upon it. We've had very little problem with the Ugandan IRB because they realize what the real context is. I mean, not that they are not rigorous, and they insist on certain other things, but this really, I think it permeates the whole system. Permeates the IRB.
It's isolated to HIV then, not to other interventions, because we don't get any of that nonsense.
Right. Whereas we get it all the time. And we keep saying if we were doing cancer prevention, every time we found a cancer, would we somehow then be responsible for treating that person for life for cancer? And the answer is no. But then for HIV, somehow it's gotten into the culture and mentality. Yeah.
I want to return to expectations, but let me make clear, given your answer, I'm not trying to ask a surreptitious Marsha Angel, Sid Wolf correction question. I'm really asking a much more basic anthropological question. From your answer, I'm assuming that whatever is known about the community expectations is known to your Ugandan colleagues and the people in Rakai, and we really don't know what those expectations are, how they've changed over time. That's somewhere over there in a black box, and the only way to get at it would be to have presumably Ugandan or other anthropologists there trying to sort that out. Is that a fair description of the situation?
I think we've done qualitative work on what makes people accept to be in a study or not accept to be in a study, whether, are folks feeling any undue coercion or too much social pressure. We did that with Zeke Emanuel from NIH. And, the sense was that people did feel comfortable saying yes or no. But their expectations are partly that Rakai will continue to provide general health services, because we do have mobile clinics that go out. We do a lot of community education. That kind of stuff is sort of part of the deal. We provide care for children. We provide prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Obviously, the last couple of years with PEPFAR funds, we also provide HIV care and antiretrovirals. So I think it's been an expanding program of services, and that, I think, is what counts. But again, for antiretroviral therapy, you don't have to be part of our studies to have access to antiretroviral therapy, as long as PEPFAR doesn't start cutting back its budget, which is a real concern for us, because if the budgets are cut and we can't then keep on enrolling the number of people we're enrolling, at some point we may have to have more obligation to individuals within our studies. And then how do we keep that from being coercive? It's a fine balancing line. But if you have suggestions for some anthropological research that might be good to do that, we'd be very happy to talk.
Regarding what you were saying about the treating the protocol as sacred text or not, I just wanted to point out in a different setting for the FDA, which is totally different, of course, but their draft guidance in February on adaptive clinical trial designs, they discussed different kinds of changes you might make that are not prospectively planned. And they say that if you have something that's externally generated, for example, a new test for HIV comes out, that's completely fine. They have no problems with introducing something that's generated from external information. But they do have a problem when you generate a hypothesis based on data that you see in the trial itself. I think it's fine to say, as you said, that
Now, obviously, just to add to that, in the trials we've been doing, if some new test came out, we were ultimately able to get it accepted. But it just, what it takes to go, if it had been left vague, we could have implemented it without going through all the protocol changes that need to be done. Whereas if you say we will use this test and then a better one comes out, you've got to go through protocol modifications at 5 different levels, and it takes forever. I think in all of our trials, we've always generated many more hypotheses than the primary hypothesis. Publish the primary one. If you have a negative trial, so be it. It hurts like hell, but do it. But on the other hand, we've always generated additional hypotheses, but we've made it very clear, this was an additional piece of work that came out of it. But again, with things like trying to publish the HPV results, well, even if they hadn't been in the original hypothesis, as long as one is very clear where this is coming from and what was and was not, I think it's perfectly fair to present it to the world. And I mean, that's where I think some people come down and say, well, if it wasn't a hypothesis, then you can't even be looking at it.
Well, obviously you were thinking about it, or you wouldn't have measured it. I mean, this concept of having a priori is somehow
I don't
sacred
think that's...
is such a bunch of nonsense that...
Well, I would say it's completely fine to publish it, and I think it's very interesting and useful. But I think that, I'm not a proponent of saying you can't look at it, but just to give what I think they're thinking. I think their motivation is that so many hypotheses generated end up being false. Some people think 80 or 90%.
But it's not any
that's okay.
It's not any different if you've written it down beforehand versus
It is. Although if you look at the ones that were written down beforehand versus the ones that weren't end up being false much more often.
But
so
in terms of the probability statements, they're no different. They can't be any different.
For instance,
they're asking, I think, rather than just about it being a priori, is are there unpublished data that were negative? So you did this test, you got negative results, you didn't publish it. So are you just focusing on your non-a priori?
Well, that's a different question.
But I think that could be what they're asking for. We're only hearing one sentence of the peer review, and that's probably, I was going to say it, but since we were out of time, and I have an appointment, I can either leave you here with everyone and say goodbye, or...
Well, Taddy, if you need to leave, I just want to add one more thing.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to, we have already discovered new bugs in Rakai, because one of the things we were doing during the trials is taking swabs, penile swabs of all the guys, and now there's this fancy new thing, pyrosequencing. So we have already, in the first sample we sent for pyrosequencing, they already identified 12 anaerobes that had not been known before. We're going to wind up with enough anaerobes to have one named after each and every one of us working on the study. And, if any of these anaerobes turns out to be potentially important for whatever reason, then we would certainly go back to our trial samples and test whether intervention compared to control arm, there's a difference in these anaerobes. And I think we'd be very comfortable publishing it as long as we said, this was not an a priori hypothesis. Nobody knew this bug was there. Or we're now looking at inflammatory markers in circumcised versus uncircumcised male penises, again, taking guys from the trial. If we find some inflammatory marker that is of importance, I'd feel comfortable publishing it as long as we said, nobody knew this was important, but here is what our data show. Go ahead and replicate the study and see what you see. Do you think that that's fair?
Oh, yeah, of course. I